Before the Mongols conquered half the known world, they were busy destroying each other, not slowly, not reluctantly, with the kind of violence that becomes routine. Raids at dawn, children taken, men left bleeding in the grass. No law, no mercy, just cycles. Raid, revenge, raid again. Genghis Khan looked at that chaos and understood something nobody else had dared to say out loud. The greatest enemy of the Mongols wasn't China, it wasn't Persia, it wasn't any kingdom beyond the horizon, it was themselves. And to conquer the world, he would first have to conquer the steppe.
Here's what nobody talks about when they talk about the Mongol Empire.
Yes, they conquered more land than any army in history. Yes, they made kings beg and cities burn. But none of that was the real achievement. The real achievement happened before the First War. Before a single arrow crossed a border. It was taking people who had spent generations killing each other and turning them into the most disciplined, most feared military force the medieval world had ever seen. How do you do that? How do you take a fractured, bleeding society and make it move like a single mind? The answer involves laws so brutal they rewrote human behavior, a military system so precise it looked like witchcraft to the enemies it destroyed. And one man who understood that to build something unbreakable, you first had to tear everything down. Some of what you're about to hear is darker than you expect.
To understand what Genghis Khan built, you have to understand what he started with. Forget the image of the unified Mongol horde. In the 12th century, there was no such thing. Dozens of tribes, Merkits, Tatars, Naimans, Kerates, each operating by its own rules, its own code of survival. And the code was simple: take what you can, trust no one outside your clan, and never forget an insult. Blood feuds on the steppe didn't last years. They lasted generations. A man steals horses from a neighboring camp. That camp retaliates and takes women. A son grows up hearing the story. Then his son. Then his son's son. The original offense is long forgotten, but the hatred has become something structural, something almost sacred. To forgive was weakness. To forget was betrayal of the dead. This wasn't dysfunction. It was the only rational system available. When there's no law, anyone actually enforces violence is the law. A tribe's willingness to retaliate is the only thing keeping it from being raided into extinction. The brutality wasn't chaos. It was logic. But that logic had a fatal flaw. It kept everyone small. Every new alliance was fragile. Every powerful leader was a threat to every other leader. Unity required trust, and trust required something the steppe had never managed to produce: a reason to believe the man next to you wouldn't sell you out the moment something better came along. The Tatars poisoned Mongol leaders. The Merkits kidnapped women from rival camps. Switching sides wasn't cowardice. It was survival. And so the steppe bled. Season after season. Generation after generation. An army of 10,000 could never be assembled because you couldn't keep 10,000 people in the same camp long enough to call them an army. That was the world Temujin was born into. And it nearly killed him before he ever had a chance to change it. He was 9 years old when his father was murdered. Yassa, a minor chieftain, was poisoned by Tatars on the ride home. He made it back to camp. Just barely. Then he died. And just like that, the protection was gone. The clan didn't grieve. They calculated. Yassa was dead. His widow and children were now a liability. So they left, not slowly, not apologetically, they just left. A mother and her children on the steppe in winter. With almost nothing, Temujin survived by eating roots and rats. That's not metaphor, That's what happened. But here's what mattered. He watched everything. He noticed exactly how the system worked. Loyalty lasted only as long as power did. The moment a man fell, everyone who'd sworn to him started reconsidering their options. He was betrayed by allies, captured by enemies. At one point, he escaped with a wooden yoke locked around his neck, hiding in a river, barely keeping his head above water. Each of those moments taught him something. Betrayal was the language of the steppe. He didn't learn it to use it. He learned it to build something that could survive it. Something that didn't snap the moment it was tested. When he started gathering followers, he made one radical choice. He didn't reward clan loyalty. He rewarded the men who stayed when staying made no sense. The ones who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, those men he elevated. Gave them rank. Gave them power. The men who abandoned him, he remembered those too. The steppe ran on fear and opportunism. Temujin introduced something it had never seen before: consistent consequence. Stay loyal, you rise. Betray, you die. Not sometimes. Not when convenient. Every single time. Word got around. Warriors came. Not because they loved him, not at first, but because in a world where every alliance collapsed eventually, he had become something almost impossible to find. Predictable. And on the steppe, a man you could predict was worth more than gold, but followers alone weren't enough. To break the cycle of tribal violence for good, he needed something deeper than loyalty to a single man, something that could outlast him, something that could bind people who had spent their whole lives as enemies. What he created next would shock even the people who served him. There had always been customs on the steppe, unwritten rules, things your father told you. The Yassa was not that. It was a written legal code, systematic, absolute, designed to do one thing above everything else: destroy the old world and replace it with a new one. Theft, death. Desertion in battle, death. Betrayal of a commander, deaths. Saw a deserter and didn't report it, death. And here's the part that changed everything: the punishments applied to anyone, regardless of tribe, regardless of rank, regardless of blood connection to Temujin himself. On the old steppe, law was personal. A chief's brother could do what a common man couldn't. A powerful clan could ignore rules that bound weaker ones. The Yassa said, no one is above this. And Temujin enforced it. Against his own allies, his own generals, his own family. For men who had lived their entire lives in a world where every rule bent under enough pressure, this was almost incomprehensible. But it worked. When a Mongol warrior knew the man riding beside him was bound by the same code, couldn't steal from him, couldn't abandon him mid-battle, couldn't sell him out, something shifted. Not friendship, not affection necessarily. Trust, the cold, functional kind. The kind that actually makes an army work. Tribes that had raided each other for generations now shared the same camp under the same law. The blood feuds didn't vanish overnight, but they had somewhere to go: to the code, not to a blade. The Yassa didn't just create order, it created a new identity. You weren't a Merkit anymore. You weren't a Tartar. You were Mongol, bound to every other Mongol by the same obligations, the same consequences, the same fate if you broke faith. For the first time, the cycle had been interrupted. But Genghis Khan wasn't done, because law alone doesn't win wars. For that, he needed a different answer to a question that every man on the steppe thought he already knew the answer to. Who deserves to lead? And his answer was going to make enemies of every powerful man alive. On the steppe, power had always moved the same way. Father to son, chief to heir, blood to blood. It didn't matter if the son was weak. Didn't matter if the heir was incompetent or cruel. The bloodline was the authority. Challenge it, and you challenged everything that kept the social order standing. Genghis Khan tore it apart. Not gradually, not diplomatically. With the same deliberate force he used on everything standing between him and a functioning empire. He promoted men based on one thing, what they could actually do. Not their father's name, not their tribe, not how many generations back their lineage traced to some celebrated warrior. If you were capable, you rose. If you weren't, it didn't matter who you were. For the aristocratic clans, this was existential. Their entire claim to power rested on birth. Remove that, and suddenly every low-born warrior with real talent becomes a competitor. The hierarchy isn't sacred anymore. It's just a ladder anyone can climb. Some of them never forgave him for it. But the men who rose through that system, they became something the steppe had never produced, commanders loyal not to a clan, not to a bloodline, but to the leader who had given them everything and could take it back just as fast. Subutai was born the son of a blacksmith on the old steppe. That's where his story ended. But he could read terrain the way other men read faces. He could anticipate enemy decisions before the enemy made them. He could coordinate forces across distances that made other commanders nervous just to think about. Genghis Khan saw it and elevated him to the highest military positions in the empire. Subutai would go on to win over 60 battles across Eurasia. Russian princes, Hungarian knights, Chinese armies. Military historians still study him. He was a blacksmith's son. Under the old system, he would have shoed horses his entire life. Then there was Jeeb, a man who had once shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle. Fighting on the opposing side, most rulers would have had him executed on the spot. Genghis Khan asked his name, acknowledged the shot, and gave him command. That story spread. Deliberately, it sent one message to every warrior on the steppe: your enemy isn't just a threat. He might be your next general if he's good enough. Commanders who earned rank through ability had everything to gain by winning and everything to lose by failing. Their success and the empire's success became the same thing. No clan politics, no divided loyalties, just results. But even the sharpest commanders can't win wars alone. They need soldiers who hold formation when men around them are dying, who execute a plan under conditions that make ordinary people freeze. Building that kind of soldier required something far more demanding than any law or promotion system. It required turning an entire people into something they had never been before. Discipline, at its most basic, is just fear of consequences. Genghis Khan understood that. But he also understood something deeper. Fear alone breaks under enough pressure. When a battle turns and men are dying around you, fear of your commander isn't enough to keep you moving. You need something structural, so embedded in how an army operates that individual panic becomes irrelevant. He built that around one concept, the decimal system. Every warrior belonged to a unit of 10. 10 units became 100. 10 hundreds became 1,000. 10 thousands became a tumen. At every level, the unit functioned as a single body, bonded, mutually responsible, collectively accountable for every man inside it. If one man deserted, his entire unit of 10 answered for it. This wasn't cruelty, it was engineering. Desertion didn't save you, it condemned the 9 men beside you. The men you'd trained with, eaten with, slept next to, in the same freezing camp for years. They would come after you, not because they were ordered to, because you had just signed their death warrants. The result was unit cohesion that stunned enemies who survived long enough to describe it. Mongol forces didn't scatter when battles turned difficult. They executed under arrow fires, under cavalry charges, inside ambushes that would have shattered most medieval armies. They held formation, followed signals, adapted in real time, because breaking wasn't just death, it was the death of every man who had trusted you. Then there was battlefield communication, signal flags, drums, smoke, a system that let commanders direct thousands of horsemen across enormous distances without slowing down. An enemy watching a Mongol army move would see what looked like chaos. Units splitting, retreating, wheeling without apparent reason. What they were actually watching was coordinated maneuver warfare, rehearsed until it became instinct. The feigned retreat alone destroyed armies that should have won. Mongol riders would pull back, appear to break, drawing the enemy forward in pursuit. Formations dissolved. Confidence surged. Then the trap closed from 3 sides while they were still celebrating. It worked every time because every rider trusted the system completely. One unit breaking the pattern at the wrong moment collapsed the entire maneuver. In recorded history, it never collapsed. And every year, Genghis Khan ran the Great Hunt, tens of thousands of men, forming a circle across hundreds of miles of steppe, tightening over weeks, driving everything inside toward a single kill zone. Any warrior who broke the encirclement without orders faced punishment. It looked like a hunt. It was an annual rehearsal for war. By the time a Mongol army faced a real enemy, they had already executed those same movements dozens of times. What looked supernatural to their opponents was just practice. Years of grinding. Relentless practice that turned individual horsemen into pieces of a machine that thought and moved as one. And that machine was about to be pointed at the world. When the Mongol armies crossed beyond the steppe, they carried everything with them. The Yassa applied in conquered territories. Merchants under Mongol protection could travel thousands of miles without fear, because theft along trade routes meant death. And that punishment never wavered. Cities that surrendered were administered, not just burned. Religious leaders of every faith received protection, because Genghis Khan understood that people whose beliefs are respected are far easier to govern than people with nothing left to lose. This wasn't idealism. It was the same cold pragmatism that had built the army. What works survives. What doesn't gets replaced. The Silk Road moved at a scale it hadn't reached in centuries. Goods, ideas, technologies crossing continents under the protection of the same ruthless consistency that had once held the steppe. Together, the system built to conquer had learned to connect, but scale revealed the full cost. The campaigns left millions dead. Cities that resisted became examples deliberately, calculatedly, because one destroyed city could make 10 others surrender without a fight. The Mongols didn't conquer through brutality by accident. They wielded it as precisely as they wielded the decimal system. Another tool, another form of engineering. In a single lifetime, from a 9-year-old eating roots on the frozen steppe to the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in human history, Genghis Khan executed one of the most complete social and military transformations ever recorded. He didn't just build an army. He rebuilt a people. He took the very forces that had kept the Mongols' fragmented tribal identity, blood loyalty, inherited power, and replaced them with shared law-earned rank and mutual accountability so deeply internalized it outlasted him by generations. The Empire Kublai Khan ruled in China, the Golden Horde that terrorized the Russian steppe, all of it still running on systems designed on horseback, in a frozen camp, by a man who had once hidden in a river with a wooden yoke around his neck. Genghis Khan did not begin by conquering kingdoms. He began by conquering chaos. The boy who survived betrayal built a law that made betrayal fatal. The man who rose without a bloodline built a system where bloodlines meant nothing. The leader who had watched every alliance collapse under pressure built a military structure where collapse was no longer possible. The tribes that had spent generations raiding and killing one another became brothers in arms, bound not by love, but by something stronger. Consequence, shared law. The knowledge that the man riding beside you would not break, because breaking meant his death and yours. It began with a boy eating roots in the snow. It ended with half the known world looking east in fear. The greatest conquest Genghis Khan ever made was not a city, not a dynasty brought to its knees. It was the steppe itself, and once that fell, nothing else stood a chance. They conquered themselves first. Then they conquered everything else.